Hello again, and this is a lecture on biogeochemical cycles. So this is something new that has been recently added, and it's not a difficult concept. It's something that we've always talked about in this curriculum, but we really didn't name it and we really didn't give it any specifics. So at this point, you have learned that everything living has to exchange matter and energy with the environment around it. We're not stagnant beings. We don't just sit here and soak up sunlight like plants do and convert that into something that's usable. And they can't even do anything with the sunlight. They have to use the sunlight plus materials in the environment to create carbohydrates. So they're pulling carbon dioxide gases, they're pulling water from the soil, and they're combining that with the light energy to be able to create carbohydrates. So everything living, not just humans or animals or plants, but also bacteria and everything else, has to be somewhat involved in these biogeochemical cycles. So let's break down that word and talk about what that means. So the word bio means life. We have learned that we're studying life and all the processes that go on in life. And then geo is earth. And when we're talking about chemicals, we're talking about anything that could be on the periodic table. So we have elements like carbon and nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, all those things that make up living things. And the only way that we can get those from the environment is by being a part of these biogeochemical cycles. So the cycles describe the movement or the flow of these elements from the environment through living things and then back into the environment. So it's this nice process that's continual, and it keeps all the living things living. And the earth kind of acts as like a sink or a resource where all of these natural resources are stored for living things to be able to use. So we're also showing a conservation of matter. We're showing that matter is not being created or destroyed. It just changes in its composition. The cycles are interdependent on one another a lot of times. So the nutrients flow through, and this continuity of life helps to keep things living. But we have to have oxygen, we have to have water, we have to have phosphorus, we have to have nitrogen for all of the different things that we're going to learn about when you get back. So these cycles kind of depend on one another, and they allow this smooth flow of these nutrients to enable this continuity of life, to enable us to continue to create chemicals and products and things that we need to live. So we're only going to talk about 4 different chemicals. We're going to talk about the hydrologic biogeochemical cycle, which hydro means water, so you can tell that's the water cycle. We're going to talk about the carbon cycle. We're going to talk about the nitrogen cycle, and we're going to talk about the phosphorus cycle. So a cycle has different reservoirs, so places where the elements are going to be held, where they're going to accumulate, and those are going to be places in the earth. That's where the geo part comes in. Then they're going to assimilate into something else in the environment, like a living organism. So they're going from something abiotic, which is the earth, elements within the earth, to something biotic. So they're getting assimilated into things that make up living systems. And then they get released back into the environment and go back into those reservoirs, usually when an organism dies, but it also can happen through photosynthesis and cellular respiration, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in the year. So let's look at the hydrologic cycle, which is also known as the water cycle. So we've got 70% of water on the planet and only 30% of land. So the water cycle is pretty large. It's pretty involved. It happens on a global scale. You have huge bodies of water like oceans, but you also have lakes and rivers. We have ponds, we have streams, we have many, many places where we can store water on the planet. Water vapor is in clouds and fog. So that would be as the water creates or evaporates off of the planet, then it goes into storage vessels like clouds and fog. And then we can have solid water in icebergs and snow. And we also have groundwater, which is underneath the ground. And it hangs out there and sits there, and it's available for plants. So we have all different types of places where we can store water on the planet and in the atmosphere around the planet. Whenever we assimilate that into living organisms, we can assimilate it into plants by them absorbing it from the ground. So if you look here, you've got groundwater hanging out here in the soil. These roots have small root hairs, which increase surface area for the water to be able to come into the cells. So that there are air pockets within the soil, there are water within the soil, and you can then the root cells can pull in this water and take it up through the plant, and it gets assimilated into the plants that way. If we're animals, we can drink. So here I've got a nice picture of a giraffe bent down and drinking out of the water in this landscape. And then this little guy, he's very interesting because he doesn't drink at all. He is a desert, I just lost his name. It's like a shrew. They hop around. If you ever saw the movie The Star, he is one of the main characters that sees Mary, and she's pregnant and all that other stuff. But they live in the desert, so they have to be acclimated to a desert environment. They have to be adapted in order to survive that desert environment. So they eat other organisms, seeds, and different insects and things like that. And whatever water or moisture is in that organism, it takes in as its water source. And then it holds all of that as its water source and releases extremely dry pellets as feces. So sometimes we can eat other organisms, and that is our water source. We don't actually have to drink because there's not a whole lot of areas in the desert where there's a water source for these organisms to drink. When we release that water, plants do it through something called transpiration. We will talk in depth about that, and that's how we continue water movement throughout the entire plant, because it's coming from the soil, but it has to go into all of the cells, just like our body has to have water in all of the cells. So it moves through the root system, it moves out of the leaves, and it evaporates off of the leaves and becomes water vapor. So then it's becoming released back into the environment. Animals, when we breathe, if you've noticed how you can breathe on a mirror and it fogs it up, if you touch that, then it's kind of wet. That's because we create water vapor when we breathe. We release liquid waste, waste in the form of urine. We evaporate water off of our skin when we sweat. You can see this dog is drooling, and if you felt the panting that's coming off of there, it releases water vapor as well. So here is a good picture of the hydrologic cycle. We have precipitation, so once we get in those clouds, we can bring it back down to the earth whenever it rains. It evaporates off of the oceans and the lakes and different areas on the ground, and it goes back into the clouds, back into moisture, and that's held as water vapor. We have groundwater that can flow from lakes to rivers to oceans to streams. So all of these different things keep that cycle of water moving in between abiotic or non-living parts and biotic things like plants and animals. The second one we're going to talk about is the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle will become a little bit more important whenever we talk about photosynthesis here in the next couple of months. So there's a few different places where carbon can be stored. One is in the atmosphere. That's the biggest carbon sink or carbon location for storage. Every time we breathe out, we're releasing carbon dioxide as a gas. That's a byproduct. We don't need it. Now, plants are going to take that in, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But all living things are called respirators. And that means that we all take in glucose. Everything survives on glucose. And we take in oxygen. And then we do a lot of chemical reactions and end up producing some energy, which we'll talk really in depth about. A little bit of water, which keeps our cells full, and then we produce that carbon dioxide as a gas, and we breathe that out. Also, we have fossil fuels. So anytime that there's a carbon-based life form that dies over lots of years, okay, there's much debate about it, we create coal and oil and all of these carbon-based, like compressed materials that we call fossil fuels. Also, we store carbon in organic material. all of life is made of carbon. It's called being carbon-based. So plants and animals, their entire structure is made of mostly carbon. When it gets assimilated back into the atmosphere, it does in a couple of different ways. Well, plants, of course, are not assimilated back into the atmosphere, assimilated into living organisms. Plants, of course, have to use it for photosynthesis. So here's the photosynthesis equation. So on the last slide, I showed you the cellular respiration. All cells are doing this chemical reaction. This chemical reaction is only occurring in photosynthetic organisms like plants or algae or some photosynthetic bacteria. So they're taking in that carbon dioxide that was put out by respirators. They're pulling water from the soil. They're taking in light energy, and they're creating the sugar and putting out oxygen. So you can see how these two chemical reactions are related. Here we're using glucose and oxygen and turning that into carbon dioxide, water, and some energy. Here we're pulling in the carbon dioxide and water, and we're turning it into sugar. So we're going to go in depth about those two chemical reactions and show how they're related to one another, but this is how carbon gets assimilated back into living things. The only way that we can do that is if plants convert it to a carbon-based sugar molecule called glucose. So if we didn't have plants to do that, then there wouldn't be any way to assimilate that carbon back into living organisms. The only way animals get the carbon they need is to consume the plants or consume other animals that have already consumed plants. And then they break down those carbon compounds and extract the carbon to use for their own chemicals. So we'll go through that whole process in depth. Whenever we're releasing that back, we're releasing carbon dioxide during respiration. As organisms decompose, it releases carbon back into the atmosphere. Animals and plants decompose, and they both respirate, which here we're seeing again, we're releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And if we burn fossil fuels like coal or oil in vehicles, then we're also releasing carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So that's what the whole thing about the ozone layer and creating holes in the ozone layer and allowing the planet to heat back up is because of the burning of fossil fuels, which you probably learned about last year. So here's the carbon cycle. So it's not as involved as the water cycle. You have respiration, which is the major source of organic carbon going back into the atmosphere. Here you've got the burning of fossil fuels, and then of course we re-assimilate that in only one direction with the use of plants or other photosynthesizers. So there's only one arrow here. Now, we do have decomposers that will break down anything dead, and they can put some of that back into the soil that can be picked up by plants through their root system. So you do have a little bit of that. We have bacteria that are decomposers, and they help to break down larger, more complex molecules and put them back into just like carbon and things like that. Third, we have the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen's a little bit interesting. All living things have to have nitrogen, but it comes in a bunch of different forms. So you have nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, but it's really difficult to get that out of the atmosphere. You also have it in the soil. You have it in the form of ammonia, which is NH3, nitrite, NO2, and then nitrate, NO3. But again, these are really difficult to just grab and use as living systems. So they're stored in all kinds of interesting places on the planet in those reservoirs, but it's difficult to get them out if you are a living organism. That's where bacteria come to play. We could not survive without the use of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So bacteria take that nitrogen gas and they turn it into that ammonium. That's called fixation because we're taking a gas and we're fixing it into something solid. So they're taking that atmospheric nitrogen, which is a big storage area, like there's more nitrogen in the atmosphere than there is about anything else, and they're turning it into that ammonium or the ammonia. Then you've got some nitrifying bacteria that convert that into nitrites and nitrates, because every different living thing on the planet uses nitrogen in different ways. So they're constantly converting and moving and shuffling around this nitrogen and passing it in different forms. Lightning or radiation can also do fixation, And bacteria perform that other process, which I just talked about, nitrification, which transfers it to that nitrate or nitrite or nitrate. Animals, the only way that they can get nitrogen is if they consume plants or animals that contain the nitrogen. So you have chemicals in your body that are made like they're a lot, everything has a carbon backbone, but then they have lots of nitrogens in them as well. So in order to make DNA, you have to have nitrogen. In order to make proteins, you have to have nitrogen. So these are like the building blocks or the chemical components that are used to build life products that keep you living and keep your structure. So without these bacteria, it would be next to impossible for us to absorb any type of nitrogen. So they're very important, and we have to make sure that they have their place on the planet as well. To release it, decomposition's basically it. So we die, we go back to the soil that we were made from, and we decompose. And again, bacteria change that back into nitrogen gas, and they continue the cycle. Animals excrete that NH4 or NH3 ammonium or ammonia in their urine. So a lot of times, if you've had cats and they have urinated somewhere and you didn't realize it, then you get this really strong ammonia smell because it's one of the byproducts that our body uses when we break down proteins, and it puts it back into our urine and we get rid of it like a waste. So you're smelling that ammonia that is in the urine from the cats. Here is a good picture of that. And again, we're getting that back into the environment, back into living organisms with the use of bacteria. So they're very important. Phosphorus cycle is next. So phosphorus, we have some in the atmosphere, or not some in the atmosphere. We have none in the atmosphere. So there's not any gaseous phosphorus that we know of. But it is all found in the soil. You have it in sediment, you have it in rocks. Erosion happens where we're losing small portions of the rock faces whenever water falls on it, and that leaches it. We call that leaching into the ground. So little pieces of the rocks will dissolve in the water, and then that will go into the groundwater, and that'll get transferred through all the different water systems and carry that phosphorus to different areas for the living organisms. Plants take it up from the soil. So one of the key things that you find in fertilizer is phosphorus. There's also nitrogen and potassium. So you need those three things for living systems to thrive, especially plants. So one of the best things that you can do for your plants to give them fertilizer is to give them a phosphorus store. So they absorb it from the soil, and then the only way, again, animals get it is by consuming other plants or animals that contain the phosphorus. So if you're noticing a trend here, the only way that animals get these things is by eating. Plants have all the cool things where they can soak it up from the soil or they can soak it up from the atmosphere, but we don't have any of those capabilities. We are adapted to eat, and we get all of our nutrients that way. Whenever we decompose, we are releasing that phosphorus back into the environment, or we are also releasing it in our feces. So it's very interesting because some plants and animals will feast on feces because it is very nutrient rich. Our bodies will only store some of it, and the rest of it puts it out in feces because we don't need it right now. So it's very energy efficient. We're not going to store a bunch of stuff that we're not going to use right now. So there's a shrew, a little mouse-like organism, and something called pitcher plants. And the mouse will lick the pitcher plant for nutrients because it has a nice sap on it with sugars. And as it's doing that, because it has such a short digestive system, it will release or defecate, release feces into the pitcher plant. And then the pitcher plant is kind of like a toilet. It looks like a toilet. I should put a picture on here for you. But that feces is full of nitrogen and phosphorus, and so it gets one of its limiting nutrients, one of the nutrients that it really needs that it has a hard time getting from the atmosphere or from the soil, just simply from feces. So we excrete those in our waste products, and then other organisms can pick it up or pull it into their being to use it. So here's the phosphorus cycle. So you've got water causing erosion. It goes into the rivers and the lakes and the streams. It can leach from the soil into those. It can leach from here into the soil. Plants and other things will like pull it up from the soil. Decomposers are breaking down the larger parts of the rocks and the soil to the smaller parts, like the phosphorus and the nitrogen and things like that. And then the plants pull that up, and then the animals eat the plants. So that was all of the biogeochemical cycle. So we're going to kind of talk about the process of all of this throughout the year. But I guess I just kind of wanted you to get some vocabulary and understand that we cannot live unless we interact with the environment around us. We are not beings that live just sitting here like plants kind of do, or plants can't even really do that. We have to pull energy and matter from the environment in order to live, and then we take that matter in and we convert it into something that is usable for us, into our cells and our chemicals that we do for life. So I hope that was informative, and I will see you guys later.